just took the engine out of the car, and now the next process is to tear down the engine, get it ready for putting it up on the stand. So the first step here is to remove the motor mounts that we didn't take off when we took the engine out of the car. So we have the rear engine mount here, and on the other side, oh sorry, this is the rear. This is the rear engine mount, and the other one was the front. So you can see here they're just held on by some 14mm bolts. So we're going to take these off first, and then we're going to get to the wiring harness next, pull that off, and clean up the disassembly a little bit. So let's get to it. So there we go, we have both the front and rear engine mounts removed from the engine. So now the next step here is going to be removing the engine wiring harness. And so what we need to do is go through and disconnect all the electrical connectors to all the sensors. If anything is connected to the transmission or engine for grounding purposes, we need to remove those. You know, all the alternator connections, everything that's connecting the wiring harness to the engine needs to be disconnected so we can get this off. You're going to have to unbolt this part here. This is the sort of the protector, electrical protector, and to the fuel injectors, things like that. So let's go ahead and do that and remove this wiring harness. The engine wiring harness has been removed. We can see it over there, and we can see now just how much cleaner the engine looks. It's going to be much easier to work on, to pull things off once that wiring harness is off. So just be careful when you're removing each connector. Don't force it, don't pry it off. They will snap, they will break, and then you're going to have a hard time, you know, either sourcing new connectors or keeping that connector onto the sensor. It might jiggle off. So just take your time, take it easy, pull that wiring harness off. And now the next step here, we're going to clean up the engine a little bit. We're going to remove the exhaust manifold. We're going to get that tranny off, and then we can get it up on the stand and start really, you know, taking it apart properly. So let's go ahead and do that now. The next step here, we're going to pull off the alternator. So just undo the bolts that hold the alternator on their brackets. We're going to remove this alternator. We can take off the drive belt. Just want to get it out of the way. It kind of sticks out of the engine. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And then right after that, we're going to move to getting rid of the starter in preparation for removing the transmission. The 20 valve engine has a tranny stiffener. So this is a aluminum support that connects the block to the transmission underneath the oil pan. So we're going to have to remove that as well. We may have to lift the engine a little bit just to maneuver it with the engine hoist. This is why we keep the engine hooks on, so we can lift it and move it around and maybe get underneath. So we're going to do that. We're going to remove the starter and the brace there in preparation for removing the transmission. So once we get the transmission off, we can get the flywheel off, and then we can mount the engine to our stand. And again, it mounts from this end. That's why we have to get everything off, you know, from here onwards. So let's go ahead and do that now. So the starter and alternator are now removed. You can see here now we have a lot of space to work with in this part of the engine. And we started taking off the bolts for the tranny stiffener. So what we're going to do now is put the engine on the hoist, raise it up so we can get that tranny stiffener off. And then we're going to start removing all the long bolts that are connecting the engine block to the transmission. And this transmission is going to fall off. And then we're going to have access to the clutch and the flywheel in preparation for putting this long block up on the stand. So let's go ahead and get that done. Another thing you can do to make this process easier is to remove the clutch slave. So we're going to remove all this bracketry and the clutch slave cylinder itself. Just have to do a couple bolts and get this thing off the transmission. And this is just going to clean up this area. These are fairly delicate parts. We don't want to smash those or bend them or break them. So let's remove that before we try and get the transmission off. And then we can go ahead and get that done. So you can see we have the clutch slave off. And now we have the engine being held by the hoist. And we're going to get under and get at, you can see here the other bolts for the tranny stiffener. It's this silver piece right here. And so we're going to get all those bolts off, remove that tranny stiffener, and then we're going to get this transmission off by undoing all the bolts around the circumference of the transmission engine block connection. So let's go ahead and get that done. So now we have the manual transmission removed from the engine. All you had to do was take a few of the bolts, or all the bolts around the circumference that connected the tranny to the engine, and then lift the engine up so it's sort of vertical and just sort of jiggle it around, and the transmission will pop out. You can see the spline shaft there, that'll just pop out and fall down. And now we have the engine to work with. So we're going to have to take off the clutch with the pressure plate there, then we can get at the flywheel. Once we take the flywheel off, we can have access to all the holes there that we need to mount this long block to the engine stand. So we're going to have to take this off first. We're going to reorient the engine so we can get to it, and then get that off and put the engine up on the stand. So let's do that now. So the engine's been maneuvered so that we have access to the pressure plate, the clutch, and the flywheel. So the first thing we need to do is get this pressure plate off, and it's held in by a bunch of 12mm bolts, as you can see. Now the problem with working on this part of the engine is that as soon as we try and apply any torque to any of these bolts, the entire thing is going to try and spin. It's going to not allow us to apply that torque. So the way we get around this is, one, we can either use an impact gun, which hits those bolts very quickly, and that can pull the bolts off. But that's a pretty rough tool for, you know, bolts of this size, and you want to try and use your hand tools if you can, so that you don't damage anything. And so what you need to do is lock the crankshaft in place so that we can apply this torque. And the way we do this is we have a crank pulley tool. So I have a video on how to make one of these. That's really easy. You just get a bar of aluminum, and so we screwed in the two bolts into the crank pulley, and now I can control the position of the crankshaft. So what's going to happen is when we're trying to crank down those flywheel bolts, this is going to turn until this bar can't turn anymore. It's being physically stopped by either the floor or the dolly here, and now we can apply some torque. So we need to have this crank pulley tool installed so that we can work on the back of the engine and get everything off. So now we're going to go ahead and pull this all out and show you what it looks like. So the clutch and pressure plate came off together. We have the clutch here, the pressure plate, and then we have the flywheel. So to remove the flywheel bolts are a little bit special. They have a 12-sided design, so you need to buy a special socket to get those out. I happen to have one. I think it's a 14mm 12-point socket. You can just go to your auto parts store and buy one of these special sockets, and we're most likely going to have to use the impact gun on these ones, but I'll try with just the hand tool first. Let's go ahead and pull those off and get that flywheel off. Alright, we have the flywheel off. Taking out those flywheel bolts needed the impact wrench. That's because I used some blue Loctite on those bolts. Probably more than I should have, so those were really hard to get out, so we had to use the impact gun. We can see here now the flywheel is out. And so now the final step here is lifting up this engine and putting it onto our engine stand. So we have a few points here where we can screw in some bolts. One down here, one up here, one up here, and then one on the far corner. So 4 in total. And we can arrange our arms so that we can fit that engine on there. And then once it's up, we can start tearing down the intake manifold, exhaust manifold, take the head off, and get inside those cylinders. So let's go ahead and do that now. Alright, so here we have it. The 20 valve 4AGE engine is up on the stand, ready to be torn down or rebuilt. So you can see here for our engine stand we just needed to have 4 bolts going to those 4 holes that I showed earlier. And so now we can work it at chest height, take off the exhaust manifold, take off the throttle bodies, the fuel rail, all the distributor, all the intake for the cooling stuff, and all the pulleys on the front. And then we can take the head off, get inside those cylinders, we can drain the oil, take off the oil pan, and rebuild this from scratch. So that concludes the teardown part 1. We'll be moving to teardown part 2 soon here, where we're going to get into the long block. But just to get the engine up from your car up onto the stand, this is what it took. Time maybe about an hour and a half. If you work diligently and always remember to be safe and use the proper tools, you should be fine. So good luck, and let's wait till part 2.